Hello YouTubers, and welcome to my first ever video for Tarantula Haven, and hopefully not my last. First things first, why am I doing this? You might want to say I've been inspired. I've seen other YouTubers out there, and I'm an educator by trade, so I feel like I've got a little bit of information that I can pass on. I've seen a lot of videos out there. There's a lot of misinformation about tarantulas, and there's a lot of good information too, but I just feel like there's just not enough out there. So I'd really like to contribute to the amount of information out there for the hobby, because it's such an interesting hobby, and I would like to expand that as well. When I first started thinking about what kind of video I wanted to shoot, I really didn't have any ideas, because there's a lot of stuff that's been done. There's a lot of people out there doing stuff. So I figured I'd start at the beginning. What was your first tarantula? So here we go. Okay, so I'm sure most of you guys probably already know what kind of tarantula was my first tarantula. When I first got a tarantula, it was probably in the about 1998 or so, and I really wanted one as a kid. I had seen several tarantulas, I've held some, and I was really interested in them, but I really didn't know much about them. And when I was a kid, my parents wouldn't let me have one. So as I became an adult, I wanted one, and it was just kind of on a whim. It was a thing where I walked into a pet shop that had just opened, and I saw it. It was $10, I believe, and so the price was just too good to pass up. So I figured this would be where I would jump in to the hobby. And my first tarantula, and I have it right here, was, as most of you kind of predicted, the Grammostola rosea, or at least what I thought was Grammostola rosea. So what I have here is Grammostola porteri. And of course, back in that time period when I first acquired my first tarantula, everything that looked like a Chilean rosehair, what they considered a Chilean rosehair, despite whether it was Grammostola porteri or rosea. But this one is Grammostola porteri. And I picked her up at a Petco, just like I picked up my first one. This is not the same one that I picked up all those years ago. That one died a long time ago because I didn't know very much about husbandry, and that's important. You know, that's important to know as much as you can about the pet that you have, the species that you have. So this is Grammostola porteri, and I know you're probably saying, oh God, here he goes, he's talking about the pet rock of the tarantula hobby. But you know, they might be the pet rock of the tarantula hobby. Some people say they're a great beginner species. Other people say that they're not, that they're kind of unpredictable. And that can be true. And that just depends on the particular spider that you have. They all have their own dispositions. They all act differently. They might share similar characteristics, but every single one is an individual, just like you and me. This particular one tends to be a little bit skittish, but once you have it out and about, it tends to calm down, likes to move around a lot, as you can see. Now, why is this such a good beginner species? For one thing is they're very hardy. They like their enclosure dry. They don't need a whole lot of moisture in there. You should keep some water in there in a water dish to keep them moist, or for them to have some water to drink. But as far as keeping the substrate wet or anything like that, you don't have to do that. They like it nice and dry in their enclosure. So that's a good thing. Another thing is that because they tend to be the pet rock of the hobby, they do sit out a lot. And that's a good thing if you want a nice display pet. A lot of people like to show off their spiders. They like to show off their tarantulas. So they're there are some species out there in the hobby that don't want to be out and about, what we call a pet hole, and they tend to hide all the time. You never see them. The only time that you actually see them is when you feed them or when you do changes in their enclosure and things like that. So that's not a very good spider to have if you're looking for something that you want to show off as a display pet. So they do make excellent display pets. They do sit out and about. Mine has a piece of coconut shell half that it uses as its hide, and a lot of times it just sits on top of that coconut shell, and it's pretty cool to sit there and watch it. It does move around periodically, so it is not a boring species as a lot of people tend to think. Another thing about them is that they are fairly docile, and if you've noticed, I kind of use my hands to guide it around. I do tend to use my little stick here because I do worry about it. Like I said, it is kind of flinchy, it is a little bit skittish, so I worry about it taking off and running, or I do worry about getting bitten. I don't want to get bitten, so that's why I use my painter stick to kind of guide it around. One thing that people tend to shy away from as far as the Grammostola porteri, the Grammostola rosea, is that they do have a tendency to fast. This one has probably gone about 2, maybe 3 months without eating, and if you are not aware of that, if you don't know that they're prone to fasting, then you might worry. You might want to think that there's something wrong with my pet. So it's not really something that you have to worry about. This one is probably getting ready to molt. She's gone a while without molting, so they tend to slow down a little bit. Before they molt, they won't eat, so that's probably what's going on with this one. Eventually it will molt, and when it has its fresh new molt or its new exoskeleton, it'll be ready to eat and it'll go again, and once again it'll slow down and it'll quit eating for a long time and worry you to death, and then it'll just go right back to normal. Another thing to be concerned about, or another thing you might be concerned about, is that they do tend to be a little bit unpredictable, but that's the same thing with just about any tarantula. You can pretty much, once you've gotten used to being around the arachnids, you can kind of predict what they're going to do. In my opinion, there really isn't such a thing as a completely unpredictable tarantula. Once you get to understand their behaviors and you get to understand how they function, then you kind of have a feel for what they're going to do. A tarantula that is skittish is going to act skittish and is going to do certain things. And the Grammostola porteri, they tend to be more docile, slow moving, so they're pretty easy to determine how they're going to behave. And if you don't know if you want to handle it, which I don't encourage, but some people do, and let's face it, everybody's going to want to handle their pet, right? So especially if it's one for being, or known for being somewhat docile, you're going to want to hold it. So a good rule of thumb is something that you want to follow if you do want to hold it, is test their mood. They can have moods, and sometimes they're willing to do it and sometimes they're not. If you use something to prod them with, usually you just come up to the side or behind in their abdomen, and they will move and let you know. If they turn around and they flare up at you, throw up their legs and show you their fangs, then obviously you don't want to mess with them. But if they're looking like this and they just kind of move around slowly and don't really care one way or the other that you're messing with it, then it's probably okay to put your hand out and guide them onto your hand, and then you can hold them for a little bit and so on. So that's just with any tarantula. I don't recommend that at all with your with some of your hotter species, your old world tarantulas, because their venom is a whole lot more toxic, and they can really mess your day up if you do something wrong with it, or if you do get bitten. Another thing I wanted to address is the urticating hairs. Because they are a New World species, they do possess urticating hairs. This one has never flicked hairs at me. As long as I've owned it, it has never actually shown me any threat display or flicked hairs or done anything of the sort. So again, that just lends to how good this species is as a beginner. This is my particular one. Yours might be different, but it has never ever threatened or tried to flick hairs at me. It prefers to run, and if I if I'm cleaning the enclosure, if I'm doing something in the cage, it will prefer to run and it will hide rather than try to stand and fight. So that's just the nature of this particular one. Now, this next tarantula I'm going to show you is Grammostola rosea. I figured I'd give you a basis of comparison. So this is an actual rosea. This one tends to be a bit more defensive than the porteri, although it's not showing that right now. But whenever it's in its enclosure, it has a tendency to do threat displays. If it's disturbed, if you're trying to reach in there and touch it or anything like that, it can and will turn around and try to bite you. So, you know, everyone is different, but this one tends to be a little bit on the defensive side. Now, if you can see, this has a much more reddish color to it than the porteri. So you can actually see that it truly lives up to its name Rosea, because it does have rose hair all over it rather than just on the carapace like the porteri tends to do. But even though this particular one has a tendency to be somewhat defensive, once it's out and about, it will kind of chill out and won't be so bad, and you can nudge it around with your hand and so on. Although I tend to get nervous because I'm worried about getting bitten. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed my first video. I know I talked more about the porteri than I did the rosea, but the truth of the matter is the husbandry is the same. The only reason I talk more about the porteri is you will tend to find more porteri in pet shops than you will an actual rosea. If you want to get an actual rosea, I would suggest you go to an expo or maybe even purchase online, and then you can assure that you definitely get a rosea if that's what you're after. If you liked the video, please hit the like button for me. And if you want to see more, I already have another one in the works. Hit the subscribe, and I'll see you then.